Vikings, A Concise History of the Vikings. Written by Bernard Hayes. Narrated by J. Huff. Chapter 1. The Beginning of an Era. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway are the homelands of the Vikings. Prior to the Viking Age, these regions were not well-defined political regions until this age when they began to form. The common borders of these regions have changed many times throughout history, and while the geographical appearance of these lands have changed throughout the years as well, the conditions of these regions remain much the same as it did during this ancient era. Modern Scandinavia's foundation was carved during the Viking Age, and never previously or since have so many pivotal and fast changes occurred in their history. Scandinavia had never played such an important role on the global stage. The Vikings during this period could move easily from Greenland to Spain and to many regions. They appeared under many different guises. Vikings were referred to as traders, pirates, warlords, explorers, immigrant farmers, and conquerors. High-quality, crafted ships and tough seamanship allowed the Vikings to travel great distances, and this also contributed to their warriors' achievements abroad. Their high mobility and surprise attack style only aided the Vikings in their search for wealth and power. Because of trade associations, the Vikings were familiar with many of the lands they set out to conquer, and they themselves adapted easily to others' ways and customs. Life varied quite a bit in the different regions of the north during the Viking Age, as there was a great distance between the regions. Not all tribes, clans, and regions of Scandinavia worshiped the same gods regularly. Their political and legal edicts were dissimilar. Even their runes varied to a degree. These geographical differences also indicated agricultural variations in practice and difference in building and construction. Raising livestock in Denmark wasn't nearly as hard as it was in much of the rest of Scandinavia, as longer and harder winters in other regions often dictated that animals needed to be stored indoors for many months to ensure survival. While a major export for Denmark was their livery, hunting and furs were bigger exports for the other, colder regions. However, each region had many differences during the subsequent Viking Age. A defined cultural entity began to emerge among the scattered people. The natural resources that Scandinavia provided make the region almost completely self-sufficient, and it was more remote and separate from the rest of the European nations of the time. Being almost surrounded by water, the most prominent and inhabited areas of Scandinavia were coastal locations. Being near so much water, the Vikings naturally were adept and advanced in their construction and knowledge of ships, and communicating by way of the sea was much easier for them to adapt to at earlier points in history than many other regions of people. From the 8th to the 11th century, Scandinavians were prominently figured in the history of Europe as settlers, invaders, and conquerors. The British Isles and Frankish Empire were plundered extensively, and there are documented raids of these Viking warriors as far as northern Africa. During the 9th century, they gained control of many regions, including parts of England, and established themselves bases along the Irish coast. The bases along the coasts of Ireland served as front-line locations for them to launch attacks on the lands easier. Western Scandinavian clans immigrated to settle much of the British Isles, Iceland, and other small islands and locations previously uninhabited. In the later years of the 10th century, the Vikings began to also settle in Greenland and explore in North America. The assault the Vikings led in Western Europe came to a peak in the early years of the 11th century, when the Danes conquered England and its kingdom. Other Viking clans from what is eastern Sweden were similarly raiding in Eastern Europe during this time. While Eastern Europe did not have the wealthy churches and well-established villages, the Vikings did exploit the wealth of furs and slaves of the region. Some Viking chieftains were able to gain power in certain areas, and many settled in what is now Russia. The very first Viking raid reported in Western Europe was conducted against a monastery in the British Isles known as Lindisfarne. In 793, the monastery, off the coast of Northumberland, was attacked, and in 794, another monastery was similarly attacked. During 795, the Vikings began to conduct raids on the monasteries in the west, including those located on the coast of northeast Ireland, and were quite successful in their endeavors, as most monasteries at the time were unguarded and ill-prepared at best. The first recorded outright raid of the continent was in 799, at St. Philibert's, also an island monastery. There were likely also raids in southeast England, but none were reported until 835 AD. It is apparent that by the last decade of the 7th century, the raids were an epidemic to the region, as rulers and kings on both sides of the English Channel began to act against the raiders. Many historians have suggested that the Vikings began to raid and conquer because of increased population in Scandinavia, but there is little to no evidence that there was ever societal pressure during the Viking Age to move or relocate because of population increases. Most warlords and warriors who set sail and engaged in raiding other regions were seeking wealth, not lands to rule over or settle. While it is accurate that many Vikings chose to immigrate and settle regions as they were conquered, most of those who chose to relocate to the British Isles, Russia, and Iceland did so because the idea of having more land than was possible in their native Scandinavia was an appealing idea to them. Where each of the respective Viking tribes chose to embark was greatly influenced by their varied landscapes. Norse Vikings embarked westward, as the voyage across the North Sea would certainly allow for quicker landfall on the mainland of Scotland. These easy-to-reach northern isles were close steps to Ireland, northwest England, and Iceland. The Icelandic settlers, in turn, moved towards Greenland, and Greenlanders set out to explore the North American coastlines. Sweden set their sights on the east, as did the Danes to a degree. Sweden had already established Scandinavian villages on the east and south coasts of the Baltic Sea, and developed trade had already tentatively begun. The beginning of the Viking Age was marked for Sweden by this regularly established contact via trade with the East, specifically the Islamic Empire in Asia. The Danes did follow suit along the Baltic Sea, as Sweden did, but the region's focus was west, along with the south coast of the North Sea. This region was controlled by the Frisians. The Frisians were recognized as accomplished merchants during the 8th century, and had well-established trade contact with Scandinavians at this point in history. It is no irony that the Frisians became a central target for Viking raids during the 9th century, as their wealth made them well-known and easy targets for the Viking warriors. One main factor in the surge of raids was the commercial expansion in northwest Europe that had begun almost a full century before the first reported Viking raids. Trade between Scandinavia and England during the end of the 7th century had already created an increase in trade locations. The result of large trading centers and new developments began to impact Scandinavia, and the highly sought-after furs of Scandinavia by European countries only increased trading more. During the summer, merchants would sail into the Baltic, buy valuable furs, whetstones, and amber from the Vikings at these established trade locations, and sail back to Europe before the winter months arrived. These commercial ties between the North and Western Europe only helped pave the way for the Vikings to begin to raid. Trading bred familiarity, and this newfound knowledge led to the advancement of Viking ships and sails. This contact also gave the Vikings insight into how Europeans traded, what their measure of wealth was, and the gossip they brought along with them gave the Vikings insider information on who was warring with whom. Chapter 2: Daily Life During the Viking Age. Weaving and Tapestry. During the Viking Age, Norse women played a vital role in the overall operation of the home. They provided to their homes and families as well as the men, and often without the presence of a strong female, a household would struggle and easily fall to ruin. The primary tasks Viking women undertook, aside from cooking, was the crafting of clothes for the family. Even in wealthier Viking homes that could afford to purchase silks or woolen cloth from other regions mercantile, weaving and spinning likely occupied many hours of the day. The wealthy Viking homes would have had slaves to aid in this grueling, laborious activity. The drawn-out task of spinning and weaving would first begin with plucking or shearing wool from sheep. Once the wool was removed from the animals, it would need to be spun, possibly dyed, and would then need to be shrunk and filled to help close gaps in the material made. Filling is the process of soaking the material in alkaline substances to reduce oils. Urine would have been one of those alkaline substances. Once the above steps were completed, the cloth would then be cut with shears. Clothes, rugs, sails for ships, wagon covers, and even tents would have been made from cloth and woolen materials processed this way. South Scandinavian regions grew flax and would make linen using a similar process as the northern regions. Meals and diet. Meals were prepared twice daily in Viking Age homes, one meal at morning and one in the evening. All daily tasks would have to be completed around the two important meals. Viking diets would vary greatly from region to region, but because of the population centralizing more toward the coast, it is easy to assume that fish was a staple of most Viking meals. Onions, peas, garlic, and cabbages were the most common vegetables grown. Viking-era bread was often coarse, as they were often full of substitutes for grain, including pine bark and dried peas, along with coarse ground wheat. The dough was kneaded in wood troughs and baked on embers. Grinding and baking would have also been daily household tasks, and bread would have to be eaten while it was still hot, as it would have been too hard to eat once cooled, as it was unleavened. Protein sources also consumed by Vikings included goat, beef, pork, veal, lamb, horse, and mutton. But domestic animals were raised for several reasons besides food. Animals were also raised as a source of dairy, for riding, for their wool and hides, and as traction. Additionally, the Vikings also hunted wild game for sustenance. Whales, deer, bear, seals, eel, and reindeer were hunted regularly, and smaller game like birds and rabbit were trapped. Birds and their eggs were consumed regularly, and chicken and geese were often raised as livestock. Vikings fished both the salt and fresh waterways, and a myriad of fishing equipment has been uncovered through the years. Herring, cod, eel, and haddock were commonly traded by the Vikings and consumed. Fish and meat were either preserved for the winter or sent off for trade. To preserve these goods, most often slaves would boil seawater to retain the salt for preservation, and then the goods were pickled in brine and then smoked or dried in the wind. Milk from domesticated animals was either drunk or often made into cheese and butter. Beer, mead, and fruit wine were also made regularly for special occasions, festivals, and to see the Vikings through the long, hard winter months. Home and hearth. Being hospitable and liberal with food and drink was an admirable trait during the Viking Age, and providing hospitality was an essential trait to most Vikings. As the weather was often harsh and unpredictable, it was not uncommon for Vikings to get stuck in one location for weeks at a time unexpectedly, and it would not have been uncommon for people to arrive unannounced, seeking respite. During the winter months, evenings would be passed eating, drinking, and the recitation of poems, songs, sagas, and singing and dancing. Many discoveries of board games have been uncovered, with game pieces made from bone, wood, or glass that were moved around a wooden board. Although the game of chess would not have been known by Scandinavians until the end of the Viking Age, the games they played were probably not dissimilar. Farming and agriculture. Fields were cultivated with picks, iron blades, and hoes affixed to wooden shafts or smaller handheld spades. Bigger fields were plowed with something called an ard, which is a rudimentary form of plowing. An ard was pulled through the earth by one or more animals, was guided by men, and while it did create a groove in the dirt, it did not furrow the earth deep enough. Many times a field would have to be crossed over many times and in many directions with the ard to turn the soil enough for planting. Fertilizing fields with animal dung was a job left for slaves to complete, and it was slaves who also herded the animals and did the heaviest labor. Some of these laborious tasks would have included providing construction materials and digging peat for fuel or iron ore. Later during the Viking Age, it is apparent that a more proper and effective plow began to be used. Grains were harvested by Vikings with a sickle, and men and women both harvested together to ensure that enough food was available, not only for the people, but for the livestock as well during the winter months. Harvesting practices vary greatly by region. In Denmark, there was ample pasture for most of the animals, but locations like Iceland had to harvest enough grain for all their animals. It was a common practice in Iceland to kill weaker livestock off before the winter to preserve the grain feed. The meat from the animal killed would provide protein during the winter months, as their meat would be preserved and stored. Scythes were used to cut hay, and sometimes foliage was supplemented when needed. Driving sheep and cattle up mountainsides to allow them to feed on previously untouched pastures during the summer months was a practice that began during the Viking Age. Driving a herd to another location meant that not only would the animals be allowed to feed better, but the land would be freed up for cultivation as well. Iron works. Ironsmith and smelting were common tasks completed on many Viking farms. The iron work was done for the purpose of making weapons, nails, and rivets for the construction of boats. High-quality iron would even be traded in bars, like the way that gold bars are now highly valuable. Smithies would have a basic toolkit, including tongs and bellows, an anvil, chisels, and shears. While some villages had professional smithies, and most farms had the capacity to work iron, there were traveling iron workers who specialized in specific types of work, such as jewelry making, bronze work, or weaponry. Art. Craftsmen and artists were prominent during the Viking Age and were especially important. Most art during this time was steeped in religion, and artwork and adornments were commissioned by societal upper classes to identify them from the rest of the population. Elements of Norse mythology can easily be identified in uncovered works, but it is also interesting that as the Vikings began to plunder and raid in other regions, they often picked up designs of varying locations and began to incorporate those designs into their work as well. A good example of this would be the floral designs of the trefoil, which was a Frankish ornamentation that did not begin to become popular in Scandinavian culture until the 11th century. Viking ornamentation was often splendid, and jewelry was often functional as well as decorative. Wealth and prominence were often displayed by the Vikings by way of neck and arm rings that were made of precious materials, and necklaces, brooches, and pendants were common among those Vikings that could afford them. Much of the recovered jewelry and adornment pieces from the Viking Age are silver, with many being refashioned from Arabic silver. Payment during this era was often made by weight in silver, so these jewelry pieces were a good way for one to literally carry around their wealth. Gold was used for ornamentation as well. Most of the surviving pieces of the Viking Age come from burial sites, and almost all are Scandinavian-made. Construction. Materials used for building and construction varied greatly throughout Scandinavia, based on the region's resources. Stone, dirt and turf, wood, clay, and any combination of these materials were often used in construction. Roofs were fashioned from grass, hay, and even wooden shingles. The first buildings to be constructed using mortar and stone techniques were churches built during the 11th century, after the Viking Age. Internal freestanding posts and posts that bore the weight of roofs were constructed as techniques and methods improved. The homes of chieftains and nobility were distinguishable by their size, level of craftsmanship, and were likely carved and painted for decoration. Churches were often just as grand as the homes of the prestigious. Doors to homes were often decorated with iron fittings or carved for ornamentation, and locks were made for both dwellings and outbuildings out of iron or wood. The woman of the home was usually the one to hold the keys to the home, and this responsibility was directly linked to the individual's status. The hearth was usually in the center of what would be considered the living room in modern times, and the inside of the homes were often divided into many rooms, with little or no window openings to the outside that could not be easily shuttered against harsh weather. Floors were often simple dirt floors, and it was a common practice to spread hay or straw along the floor and add it as necessary to prevent tracking in water, snow, or ice. Rugs, cushions, and pillows, tapestries, and cloth and furs were likely the most important furnishings to the Vikings, and lockable chests were used commonly. Furniture was rare, although low stools were likely used in many Viking homes. People most often sat on the floor or crouched when eating, talking, or congregating. Sleep compartments were often built in small alcoves and dwellings, and were often simple platforms where fur could be laid upon. Runes and rune stones. Runes were already present in Scandinavia by the time Christianity was introduced. The origin of runic inscriptions is still debated, but the Vikings believed the runes were a gift to them from the god Odin himself, and most historians today agree that runes were created around the 2nd century. The oldest runes found to date are on artifacts uncovered in Scandinavia and are dated around the 3rd century. While this is a significant archaeological find, it is not until the Viking Age that runic engraving became more prevalent. Runes were often carved in metal, wood, stone, or bone. And while the parchment documentation that was common with European countries may seem more civilized than the barbaric carvings of the Vikings, the practice itself was not without its benefits. For a Christian scribe to document something, they would first have to make a parchment from animal hide, prepare an ink from metallic salts or oak galls, and then fashion a pen from goose quill, then rule the parchment out with a sharp object to keep the writing uniform. All a Viking needed to write something was a sharp-pointed tool or knife and a stick. The disadvantages of the Viking way of writing was that it would obviously be more difficult to carve out anything in length. Nordic runic characters are vertical-shaped and do not include curves. This was likely to help to carve the wood and eliminated working against the grain. Viking rune masters had developed a distinct alphabet, which included 16 letters. While the runes were indigenous to Scandinavia, each region had their own variations of the same runes. The Vikings used 2 primary types of runes, one known as the Danish futhark, and the other Swede-Norwegian futhark. Runic symbols were created for the primary engraving on wood, but they were adapted for other materials over time that were more durable. Many more examples of the runic inscription on metals and stone, as opposed to wood. Considering the stronger materials that were carved upon, rune masters could use different methods to carve, and thus these items' letters began to be more rounded, as with the letters R and B. Vikings used runes for a variety of purposes. Inscriptions were carved for memorials. Boundary posts were engraved to mark property and acknowledge ownership. Stones were carved for markers of roads and bridges, and of course, small bones and stones were carved with runes for the purposes of rune casting. Runic monuments, memorials, and markers that were exposed to the elements are now hard to decipher because of corrosion and weathering due to the elements. And another aspect of runic inscription that may be lost now is the possible painting of these symbols on objects. Most coloring has worn away, but some items today still show telltale evidence of paint colors. Red, brown, blue, and black are the primary color traces noted on ancient Viking runes, but the painting itself may have been more creative and detailed than what we will know. Runic engravings and carvings were important during the Viking Age. These inscriptions recorded the early phases of the language of the Scandinavian people and give us an idea on the way in which the ancient Vikings spoke. The areas where runes have been located also give us a better idea of the geographical regions the Vikings not only lived, but where they also visited during their era. The content in runic inscriptions gives us an indication of how Vikings saw themselves and what was deemed important to them. Rune stones also depict to us a recorded history of Viking voyages, feats, and activities that took place during the time. Some inscriptions uncovered even depict not only where someone was laid to rest, but a record of the deceased Viking's possessions. Runes could also be used as legal documentation, to name a location, or to place possession on an item or object inscribed. Runic memorials also give us an interpretation of what behavior and attitudes were prominent amongst the Vikings, and what was admired during the Viking Age in one another. Memorial engravings often depict a culture that was aristocratic, a people that were bonded by bloodlines and ties of clan and family duty. These types of memorials often praise attributes such as generosity, valor, respect, honor, and honesty. Being well known or famous during the Viking Age was usually reserved for those that were recorded for their heroic deeds. Chapter 3: Societal Norms of the Viking Age. Slavery. While the documentation of slaves during the Viking Age is prominent, there is little that remains today that gives us a fair representation of what slavery looked like during the period. Slaves were poor and had no political or economic influence, so were easily discarded without memoriam. There were crimes during the Viking Age that were punishable by slavery, and if a child was born from slaves, those children were only given the same social status as their parents. It is often considered that one of the main reasons for Viking journeys and raids was to capture, buy, and sell slaves. Some people of higher social status were sometimes kidnapped by the Vikings and held for ransom, especially if the wealthy family had ties to the Christian church. Slaves of the Viking Age were, of course, subjugated by their masters, but it seemed their exploitation was regulated by rules as well. They likely provided much of the intense labor required for building. It is documented that they worked in the fields and in homes, and female slaves were often used for sexual gratification during long voyages abroad. Ironically, female slaves that were of exceptional beauty or that had high status in a wealthy home could often live in a fair amount of luxury, and skilled slave craftsmen were often highly revered by the home as well, and thus treated kindly. Slaves were often sacrificed if their masters died, and the sex of the master and slave did not appear to be relevant. In some regions of Scandinavia, slaves could have their freedom bought for them, while in other areas, freedom only was possible after several generations of a slave's bloodline stayed within a location. Freed slaves were likely a landless, poor class of people, and often worked farms for others before being able to afford to build and work their own. Many slaves immigrated and became skilled craftsmen to earn their way. The cultural position of skilled tradesmen and craftsmen seems to be one that was greatly respected, even if the shipbuilder was a slave. Women. Much evidence available today indicated that women held a prominent status during the Viking Age, even if men did have the upper hand. Women seemed to be able to exercise an authority almost equal to their male counterparts, and were vital and respected members of society with a social class all their own. Men were often away during the summer months, raiding and sailing to distant lands, and it was the Viking women who were often in charge of the home front in their stead. Women were praised for their abilities and successful running of a home and farm, and for their skills of weaving and crafting. The family unit was important during the Viking Age, so it is no wonder that many runic monuments mention wives and women in general. Royal lineage on a Viking's mother's side was enough to claim legitimacy to any throne, and women could inherit lands from their spouses, parents, and children. While inheritances were not split equally between brothers and sisters, females were still given a percentage or piece of their own upon the death of a family member. Daughters were less likely to inherit wealth, as they needed a dowry when they were wed. Although a few women were mentioned in ancient runes that depict That there were a few women who were skilled crafters, skalds, and rune masters outside of the home, there were not many opportunities for women, other than what they could provide on the domestic home front. Women that were landowners often rented their properties to men or families. Marriage during the Viking Age was an alliance between families that were socially equaled. Women brought dowries, and men may have contributed a sum of money or wealth as well, and all things brought into a new marriage were belonging equally to the brides and grooms. Women could divorce at will, and this practice was shocking to many other regions that encountered Scandinavians. Adultery committed by men was punishable by death, while women who committed this crime were often sold into slavery. Ironically, a free man of certain wealth could have more than one wife, and children born to a free man by a slave or equal were the children of their father, and therefore seen as legitimate. Children. Children born during the Viking Age were regarded strangely. Prior to the introduction of Christianity to the pagans, unwanted children were often left to the elements, and there are very little memorial runes or burial sites for children found. Childhood itself was a brief period, and children were often given daily responsibilities and tasks from early ages. Canute the Great was only a teenager when he and his father set out on a voyage to England, and when his father died the following year, he came to power and led the army that his father had the lead. Merely 2 years later, Canute was the ruler of the entirety of England. Free people. The free class of people was the backbone of Viking society. These people were apart from the aristocracy and slaves, and this category was where most of the landowners, farmers, servants, hunters, and craftsmen and tradesmen settled. There were also merchants and professional warriors among this social class of Vikings. The free people were able to express their opinions and vote during the assembly when public issues of concern were discussed and courts were held. Free people had the right to bear arms, carry weapons, and were protected under the laws that governed the region they lived in during the era. Free people seemed to have their own classes within their class, and their status often depended upon how wealthy they were, whether they held a position of influence or importance, and if they came from what today we would consider old money or family wealth. This hierarchy is apparent as documented by varying amounts of fines that were placed on people ordered to make restitution. Most people's wealth coincided with the amount of land they owned and farmed. While many operated their own farms, wealthier families could section out their lands and lease them for other free people to work for a price. Land holdings were also the base of royalty, power, and aristocracy. The size and prosperity of a farm or land dictated the amount of wealth and social status. Other than farming, wealth could also be acquired by raiding, fighting under a chieftain or king, or by embarking on expeditions to other countries and amassing land abroad. Assets that were obtained abroad may include land, gold, silver, and bragging rights, all of which enhanced social status in the Viking Age. Immediate familial ties usually determined the opportunities in life available to Vikings, and it was usually only in royal bloodlines that extended family obligations were mentioned. That is not to downgrade or give the impression that family was not important. On the contrary, family and kinsmen were the most important obligations a Viking held to, but other ties were also important culturally. Members of a fellowship or army were tied by oaths. There were trade associations that required bonds, and common rules and obligations to the rule of law were important ties within villages. Other obligations to consider in the Viking Age were the defense of a region or common land, the upholding of edicts as passed during assembly, and religious obligations and culturally acceptable norms. Aristocracy and kings. The aristocracy and kings during the Viking Age held power over the freemen of the era. Customs dictated that the Althing, or assembly, controlled and regulated local social customs and rules of law. Historical documentation points to the collective society as being in control of major decisions that affected specific regions, and the assembly was the highest point of authority during the Viking Age. Vikings were a democratic people for the most part, and all free adults were afforded the right to not only vote on matters of importance, but also voice their opinion during the assembly. Higher-level decisions of politics were in the hands of the king and magistrates. The military power, held by the wealthy, indicate that the Althing did have to accept and bend to the edicts of the higher authority. Social class was like a pyramid. At the top sat the king and his edicts. Below him, his fellow aristocrats and their deference to him, and then the assembly. The king and the aristocracy assumed greater control over land, trade, and the production of goods. To exemplify the balance of power, although royal lineage followed bloodlines, the assembly had to willfully accept the succession from one king to another. Kings in Denmark seem to belong to a single dynasty that was established before the dawn of the Viking Age. Denmark seems to have been a united kingdom for the most part, as opposed to Norway. Chapter 4. Europe. Historians associate the beginning of the Viking Age in Europe with the accounts of Scandinavian raiders along the coasts of the British Isles during the last decade of the 8th century, primarily the raid of Lindisfarne in 793. This raid is documented in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The first documented raid on the Frankish Empire was documented in 799, and it was shortly after this specific raid that the Franks began to organize a defense against the Vikings. The first recorded attack on the mainland of Europe itself occurred in the west in 810 in Frisia. This attack was a political attack, as Godfried ordered the building of a border wall in 808. Godfried and Charlemagne were planning military strikes against one another, making them weakened to Viking raids. During the raid on Frisia, 110 pounds of silver was paid as tribute to the Vikings. Through architectural finds, Viking hoards were uncovered, attesting to the amount of wealth they amassed during the Viking Age. Large hoards of silver, metalwork, and jewels were uncovered. It became a custom to pay tribute to Viking raiders in exchange for protection from other raiding Viking armies, almost like an insurance policy to protect the region from further plunder. This was called paying Danegeld, which translates into Danish tax. While it is well documented that monks and aristocracy died at the hands of the Viking warlords, the main goal was always to hold monks, the wealthy, and saints of the church for ransom that was to be paid by a demanded weight of silver and sometimes gold. While monasteries were initially the primary targets of the Vikings, they, by no means, were the only targets the Vikings focused on. While the initial purpose of raiding Western Europe was most certainly to attain wealth, the concept of conquering to establish trade was equally part of the goal. Trading sites have also been recorded targets, as well as European families of wealth. The Viking conquests in York and Normandy became bases for Scandinavian trade and encouraged commercial development between the two continents. Over the course of the Viking Age, the tactic of raiding and then trading with the region resulted in a large trade route that was ultimately controlled by the Vikings, who instigated these actions. This practice and evolution only aided in the expansion of the Scandinavian influence in Western Europe and furthered their control in the region. The trade network set in place eventually spanned from Spain to the Mediterranean. While these raids often had violent implications for Europe, they stimulated growth and the redistribution of wealth, and even produced new population growth because of colonization, immigration, and the traveling of others along the trade route. Apart from the attack in 799 of St. Philibert's Monastery, the first recorded Viking attack took place in 820 at the month of the Sin. A fleet of approximately 13 ships attempted to raid Flanders, but was repulsed by the coastal guards set in place. The fleet then attempted a raid at the mouth of the Seine, but once again were thwarted. When the fleet finally arrived in southern France, they were finally able to reach landfall and seize what they could plunder. Later, Viking chieftains were given regions near the mouth of the rivers. In return, were asked to provide protection from other Viking pirates, and so another form of tedious defense was obtained for a price. Harald Klak was granted the region at the mouth of the Weser River, where the border between Frisia and Saxony formed. Harald was one of only 3 Danish kings during this period and had long been aligned with the Franks. Harald's position in his native homeland became unstable for him, so this new region provided him with sanctuary and a place of retreat if he was ever exiled from his home. Harald was later exiled the next year and soon became one of the many Viking chieftains who were able to take advantage of the power struggles that already existed in the Frankish Empire among the inhabitants. Louis the Pious was another Frankish ruler who was in open conflict with his 3 sons, and in 833 he was captured by his sons and overthrown. So, Louis the Pious was able to regain his rule, but he was still unable to bond the nobility for the greater good. The empire's defenses eventually broke down because of this conflict, and Vikings began streaming through steadily in the end. Dorstad was one of Europe's most prolific trade centers at the time, and it was also important, like in the Scandinavian trade network. In 838, King Horik, the ruler of Denmark, sent messengers to Louis the Pious, denying any capability for the ransacking of Dorstad, and made it known he had killed the leaders of the raiders who had devastated the region. In return for the favor, he asked to be given Frisia, but was refused. Lothar, one of the sons of Louis the Pious, and Harald Klak were the likely suspects of the raids on Dorstad and other locations, and Louis the Pious spent much of his life trying to defend and fortify his kingdom until his death in 840. In 843, the Frankish Empire was divided into 3, and each of Louis the Pious's sons was given regions to control. By this time in 843, the Viking outpour was unstoppable, but was also a financial waterfall for many people. In 835, amidst the sacking of Dorestad, Viking expeditions to South England were underway, and many such voyages followed in Ireland, escalating Viking activity in the regions exponentially. In 841, the Vikings decided to sail further up the Seine and plundered the region of Rouen. The year after that, they raided the major trade center between England and Ireland, known as Keltuvik, and Nats was also raided. The raid on Keflavik was specifically chosen on St. John's Day, June 24th, 843, and the village was full of people who had gathered for the celebration and feast. Expeditions to raid, plunder, and take tribute had grown to massive proportions by this time, and Viking raids escalated everywhere. The wealth the Scandinavians were amassing did not come without a price, though. Soon after the successful raiding of Paris, the leader of the heathen army, Ragnar, was killed or fell ill, and many Vikings began to feel that their efforts were being cursed for their deeds. King Horik of Denmark even offered to release all the Christian captives he held. Despite the losses the Vikings were taking, this did not slow their aspirations. Churches, entire villages, and monasteries all fell victim to Viking raids, and even some rural populations were targeted. Vikings took money and tribute from those regions that had it to offer, and often took slaves in areas too poor to pay the ransom they requested. In 845, many Vikings chose to settle in the countryside in Aquitaine, and in 850, they were offered land to settle after raiding along the Seine, also as entreaty by Charles the Bald to ask their help in a battle against Lothar. During this time, several Viking armies were moving among many regions, and King Charles promised a fortune to one army if they drove another, led by a Viking known as Valand, from the area in 861. The following year, this same Valand joined forces with Charles and was baptized a Christian, and Valand then fought fellow Vikings for Charles until his death in 863. During a national assembly in 864, the people gathered to discuss and debate their Viking epidemic. Royal edicts banned nobles from seizing the property of free people to prevent the nobles from undertaking military actions against the Vikings in the name of the king. Selling weapons and horses to Vikings was banned, and fortified bridges, town walls, and fortresses were ordered. In 870, the north area of central Francia was divided by East and West Frankish kingdoms. Charles the Bald held regions to the coast that stretched around the Rhine, and he decided to make an alliance with the Viking warlord Rurik, who had controlled the Dorstadt and Frisia for some time at this point. The political maneuvers that took place among the Viking chieftains, the Frankish rulers, and Denmark are indistinct in history, but it is certain that at different times Frisia gave accommodations to claimants of the Danish Empire. Vikings, chieftains, and warlords during this time amassed great wealth, thanks to political maneuvering, and enjoyed much independence and were somewhat equal to the country's own nobility. The Vikings either could not or chose not to prevent all the attacks on the region. After the consecutive raids in Dorstadt, a large flood and changes in the course of the river led to the decline of the trade center's importance. In 877, Charles the Bald died, and over the course of the next 11 years, West Francia saw 5 different rulers upon his death. During Charles's declining health, the Vikings had been busy in England with their raids, but again, they turned their sights to Francia and increased their expeditions once more. The Vikings continued to raid along the coastlines, but now began to move inland in their quest to conquer. Fortified fortresses were built to dissuade Viking raids, and defenses improved. Towards the end of the 9th century, the golden era of the Viking Age began to end. The success of the raids began to slow. The flow of gold began to cease, and the attacks were more difficult to achieve. King Alfred of England realized that the Vikings were coming back to England after several unsuccessful raids in Francia, and his defenses were effective. Finally, in 896, the Viking warriors dispersed. Some of the Vikings went to Northumbria, while others went to areas that they were familiar with along the Seine. The Vikings were defeated in Bethany in 937, but attempts to eject them from Normandy were unsuccessful. King Charles the Simple set Vikings against one another around 911 and gave the chieftain Rollo the village of Rouen and the regions surrounding it, and this area became the base of the Duchy of Normandy. Western European kingdoms became stronger during the 10th century, and power began to shift yet again, and Germans overran Denmark's south border. Frisia was targeted by a few Viking raids, but England was the Vikings' primary focus. With the exception of Normandy, the Viking Age in Western Europe finally ended. Chapter 5. Scotland and Ireland. Scotland. The overseas voyage from the west coast of Norway to Shetland only took about 24 hours, so it is likely that most of the Vikings who perpetuated the raid at Lindisfarne and the regions along the north coast of England undoubtedly traveled via the Shetlands during the 8th century. From Shetland, it was a short distance to the Orkneys and onwards to the northern region of the Scottish mainland. From that point, the route to the coast of Scotland paved the way to northern England, Ireland, and the west coasts of England. England, or the coast of Iona, easily led to the Isle of Man, which is a small island located in the Irish Sea between Ireland and England. Because of the proximity and all the islands and coasts between, it was possible for the Vikings to travel to Ireland or North England and back to Norway within a summer season. Shetland was settled by Norwegians, as were the Orkneys, the Isle of Man, and the other small islands and inlets. They also colonized on the Scottish mainland as well. The region piqued their interest, not only because the climate was like Norway, but also because gaining access to these regions opened their access to Ireland and England, which were lucrative locations, not to mention these areas' ties to Iceland. Merchant ships often carried valuable loot along this route, and the Vikings could gain plenty of wealth by engaging in piracy on these merchant ships. There were also plenty of suitable raiding bases in the region, and the Orkneys was a tactical position that became a seat of an influential dynasty of earls in the 9th century. Although it is not known for certain when the Vikings reached Scotland and the Isle of Man and settled in the area, while it is poorly documented, it is related that Norwegians defeated the inhabitants in the Orkneys and many of the farms were destroyed and rebuilt by Vikings. Scandinavians assumed power in the Orkneys and Shetlands, but it is unknown whether the people that used to live there before the Viking raids were turned to slavery or killed or exiled. Evidence of the Viking influence and presence in Scotland and the Isle of Man is an enduring one, and there is much archaeological evidence to support it. Scandinavian names and graves give us a clear picture of where Vikings likely settled, and it seems that there was a concentration of Viking settlers in the Western Isles, Shetland, the Isle of Man, and Orkney. Prior to the arrival of the conquering Vikings, there were no well-established towns or villages in Scotland or the Isle of Man, and there was no development during the Viking Age. The silver hoards uncovered belonging to the Vikings indicates that while Dublin was an established trade center, it was Orkney that was a considerably wealthy place and one that the Vikings centered on. The Orkneys were under Norwegian rule until 1468, and the Shetlands until 1496, indicating just how strong the hold was in these locations. The islands in both regions had never been reclaimed by the Norwegians, but Viking celebrations and commemorations are still prevalent. While there is even less documentation of Viking activity on the Isle of Man, the wealth of evidence of colonization of this small island between Ireland and Scotland is unequal in any other excavation sites. When the Viking raids began to cease during the end of the 8th century, it was here that other Scandinavians flocked. Ireland. The Vikings' raids and conquests in Ireland often run parallel or depend upon Viking activity in other regions. The Viking invasion of Ireland can be divided into 4 different segments, with the first segment beginning in 795. During the years of 795 through the early 830s, raiding bands of Vikings began to carry out quick raids on isolated monasteries and villages on small islands and coastal regions. These were hit-and-run style raids, and with more than 30 kilometers of coastline, defense was minimal at best. There's no documentation of the building of fortresses or guarded coasts, like the defenses that Francia set in place, and many think that the Irish fleets were weak. Local defenses were sometimes successful, but for the most part, the Viking raids on Ireland were surprise attacks that ended somewhat uneventfully. In the late 830s, the Vikings increased their raids on the region, and the attacks became more daunting. In 836, large-scale, devastating attacks began, and it is well documented during this time that when the Vikings conducted these raids, they set many locations afire, took slaves, and killed almost as many as they took captive. During one specific raid on the monastery of Clonmore, the monastery was attacked on Christmas Eve, and many were taken captive, and the place of worship was burned to the ground. It is likely that raiding persisted from the fall to midwinter, and now the Vikings were already staying over during the winter rather than returning to their homelands on small islands of the region where they could regroup with little trouble. Because they were overwintering, they could hold more slaves and prisoners without having to travel far with them, which only aided the Vikings in their goals. As the raids increased, true to their habits in other regions, the Vikings concentrated on monasteries because they offered the most wealth. Many monasteries in Ireland were akin to small villages, so while they were attacked, many were well organized enough to survive the raids, only to be attacked again. Religious artifacts were not the Vikings' main objective when looting the monasteries, as their main objectives were always the accumulation of slaves, silver, gold, and bragging rights. During this 25-year period, Vikings were not the only raiders and attackers to Ireland. Ireland itself was comprised of many small kingdoms that were almost always at war or in conflict with one another. So while the Vikings raided and plundered Ireland, Ireland warred with both the Vikings and one another. Because of the kingdom's close ties to the church, burning monasteries was often a tactic of Irish warfare. Wars also broke out among monasteries and kingdoms. Everyone fought with everyone. During the second phase of the Viking expansion in Ireland, great regions of land were raided, and large fleets of Viking warships sailed inland along the Erne and Shannon rivers. This second segment occurred between the years of the later 830s through 902. During this period, Vikings were active in England and Francia as well. In 841, the Vikings built fortresses to protect their ships and established fortified bases in Dublin and Annagassan. New fleets soon joined the already present Vikings, and in 845, the attacks began to climax, and another Viking base was built in the center of Ireland on Lough Ree in Cork in 848, Dunrally on the Barrow in 862, Youghal 866, and Dun Ambliam at Clondican in 867. Documents that were recovered from this period expressed that many Irish wondered if the Vikings would not eventually overrun the entire country. The successful invasion of Ireland by the Vikings was due in large part that the kings of Ireland continued with their own feuds with one another and still had not united to vanquish the Vikings. Churches, not knowing what else to do, decided to supplement their prayers for respite with action. Clerics began to take to the field in battle. Many abbots died in battle, and their names were recorded. During the 840s, the Viking presence was well established, and new ships arrived from Denmark and Norway, and it is possible that these forces arrived from their own raids in England and Francia. By the 850s, Scandinavians were becoming an integral part of Ireland. The superior military power and weapons were noticed by the warring kings, and many sought to employ the Viking warriors to engage in battles with opposing Irish kingdoms. This integration is noted by a rise in Norse-Irish weddings, and many second-generation Scandinavians assumed Celtic names. Scandinavians were in a large part accepted by the Irish. Many of the Vikings were baptized into Christianity, and artistry began to mingle. Around this time, the Vikings began to establish themselves as international merchants and traders, as they had the ships that were required to accomplish this feat. Trade would likely have been a concept not familiar with the Irish, but it was likely they became accustomed to these practices due to their exposure to the way the Vikings accomplished these tasks. Olaf the White from Norway and a Dane known as Ivar came to Dublin in 853 and became kings shortly thereafter. The kingdoms they grew thrived and became quite powerful. Ivar died in 873, and many years of hardship followed in Dublin until the Vikings were ousted in 902 by a coalition of Irish fighters. Many of the dejected Vikings likely ran to the Isle of Man, Iceland, and northwestern England. By 875, Danes and Norsemen were warring and competing. The Irish were waging war on one another, and Scandinavians in general were raiding and colonizing the entire country. The third stage of the Viking Age in Ireland commenced in 914 through 980. Numerous fleets continued to arrive on the Irish coasts, and new waves of raids and marauding started up again. Like the wave of Viking raiders of previous years, the raids were uncoordinated in loose groups of unaffiliated Viking bands. This wave of Vikings most likely came from settlements in Scotland, England, and the Isle of Man, as opposed to their native homelands. Other groups of Vikings were known to have come to Ireland from Wales and Wessex. There were fewer and fewer opportunities for Viking conquest during this time, and Ireland was one of the few places left for successful raids. Dublin was once again established as a Viking base of operations in 917. The extensive opportunities for trade paved the way for the establishment of many new towns in Ireland, including Waterford, Cork, Wickford, Limerick, and Wexford and Wicklow. By the middle of the 10th century, Dublin had evolved and flourished into an international trade location, and during the rule of Olaf, Dublin was the ruling epicenter of the hinterlands. As it often is with quickly rising stars, the metropolis that Dublin became began to wane, and political independence was sought in 980 in the Battle of Tara. During the Battle of Tara, Olaf was defeated by the King of Meath from Eastern Ireland. After the battle was lost, the Irish once again reigned over the Vikings, and the Vikings were required to pay tribute to them. The Vikings, who had established kingships, were allowed to keep them, and they stayed in Dublin for the most part. The Vikings also kept control over the trade route, but that may have been only in a large part to the disinterest of the Irish to handle it. In the last segment of the Viking Age in Ireland that lasted until 1170, the Scandinavian presence became a fully unified part of the Irish community and culture. The villages and towns that were established flourished, and manufacturing of many textiles strengthened the financial wealth and stability of Dublin. Irish kings became more involved in village affairs, and many took up residence in the region. Coins were minted, business was booming, and this period was one of incorporation. It was not until the English conquest of Dublin in 1170 that the prodigies of Scandinavia were finally overwhelmed and beaten once and for all. Chapter 6. Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroes. The locations of Iceland, the Faroes, and Greenland were settled by Scandinavian farmers during the Viking Age, and were likely unpopulated at the time of this colonization for the most part. There weren't any people living in the large regions of Greenland, but there were Eskimos who lived further north. These regions offered no loot or wealth, but it did offer vast lands to settle and larger acreage for homesteads. The Vikings that made the trek to these regions brought their families, animals, and possessions, and began to build communities. The conditions of Greenland tested the underprivileged Viking farmers, but many persevered and built successful farms and cultivation farms. Vikings were the first Europeans to land in America, and those who made their way to North America were farmers who came from Greenland to explore. The colonizers who settled the new region were mainly from Norway, and while the climate was harsh, it helped that it was like their native homeland. It did help that the soil was unused and therefore was rich and fertile, which made planting highly successful. The economy of the newly colonized locale was one of the agriculture that included fishing, farming, livestock raising, and hunting the animals indigenous to the region. They also gathered berries and other flora that grew naturally, aside from vegetation they planted. As it was also in Norway and Scotland, the arrival of the Vikings was somewhat uneventful as the area was not settled. There were no established villages, trade centers, or towns. The lack of good timber made the location less than ideal for shipbuilding either. It is believed by historians that the reason Scandinavians chose to move to these locations and began colonization was mainly due to their desire to acquire better land for cultivation. Many of these settlers may have been poorer and impoverished, or may have lost their homelands to political maneuvers of people in power. These new lands offered many opportunities and improved living conditions, as well as the ability to prosper more than may have been possible in their homelands. The Viking settlers probably migrated in household groups, with all their worldly possessions traveling with them, including any slaves they possessed. These colonizers would load merchant-style ships with every essential item they may need to build a new home, and set out to build a new world for themselves. Iceland. The earliest discoveries of Iceland are shrouded in mystery and myth, and most documentation regarding the colonization of Iceland was recorded many years after the fact. One source cites that by 930, Iceland was thoroughly settled by the Vikings along the coasts, the plain regions, and the southern valley areas. This same recorder gave detailed information on the discovery and settlement of Iceland, but none of this information can be verified. There are also mentions of over 400 leaders of individual settlement locations, as well as the ancestry and lineage of these people. The purpose of this documentation was likely to establish a legal registration and documentation of properties, and to help these Vikings support land claims in the 12th century. While it is believed that most of the Viking settlers that came to Iceland were from northern regions of Norway, it is believed that many were also Scandinavians, which came from settlements in Scotland and Ireland. Many of these settlers had Celtic wives, and some brought Celtic slaves as well. During the Viking Age, Iceland formed many ties to the outside world because of the new colonization, mainly between the region in Norway and the British Isles. In fair weather, it is believed that a ship can sail from Iceland to Norway in 1 week and to Britain in 5 days. Greenland was visited regularly during this period as well, and the people were extensively traveled. Wool and falcons became a major export for the region, and many Viking settlers traveled between regions, being professional warriors, traders, merchants, and explorers. From the 11th century on, Norwegian kings regulated treaties and various matters of interest, and in 1262, Icelanders recognized Norway's supremacy and reign over the land and began to pay taxes. Greenland. The settling of Greenland was documented much more thoroughly than the colonization of Iceland and the Faroes. Greenland was settled from Iceland, and the eastern coast is much like Norway. The climate is vastly different, due to the snowcaps, ice, and harsher cold elements. The richest settlement was in the south, and it was in this area that Eric the Red built his famous farm called Brattahlid. The colonization and immigration of Vikings in this region were most likely undertaken by chieftains, with large groups of people under their following who were loyal to them. It is likely that these colonizing Vikings organized settlements of not only Greenland, but the Faroes, the Orkneys, and the Shetlands. There were many probable reasons for Scandinavians to migrate to these island locations. These regions were strategically located along the trade sea route. The land was good for agriculture, and farming was successful. Agricultural was based mainly on livestock that included cows, sheep, and goats, and the soil was fertile for planting. The Vikings took advantage of the rich and untapped resources of seals, whales, and fish, and hunting reindeer, bears, and birds were plentiful. Imports that were necessary to Greenland were metals, timber, grains, and iron, and the Viking settlers could easily afford these exports by trading highly valued furs, pelts, whale tusks, whale bone, and hunting falcons. These imports, provided by Greenland, were sought after by Europe, as these were items that they did not possess in the region. Viking communities in Greenland accepted the reign of Norway over their newly colonized region, and in later centuries, Norway obtained the Danish crown. Chapter 8. Paganism meets Christianity. Norse paganism before Christ. All documentation of the old pagan belief systems of the Vikings was recorded after the Viking Age by Christians, but that is not to say they did not make great efforts to be accurate in their representation of Old Norse mythology and pagan worship. The detailed accounts documented mythology and worship practices. Some information regarding pagan customs can be assembled from early texts, from legal documentation and laws. Archaeological discoveries have given much insight into the customs of burial rites and practices. Sacrifices, monument erection, and divine symbols have been uncovered as well. The varying depictions of paganism by many different sources may be why Norse paganism is often hard to decipher, hard to understand, and seems primitive to modern interpretation and studies. During the Viking Age, paganism itself also went through changes, and the concepts of Christianity started to seep in prior to conversion. It is also important to note that Scandinavian Vikings practiced paganism differently in their own varying regions. Paganism and the Old Norse religion itself was an inclusive practice, and it was easy for the Vikings to adapt and tolerate other ideas and concepts of different ways of worship. The main ideas and concepts behind Norse paganism were similar, but which gods were primarily worshipped and their ritual practices varied greatly depending on location. The gods were responsible for all aspects of life according to the Vikings, and their appearance was depicted as being similar to the appearance of humans. The gods were represented as being almost immortal, fallible, and were divided into two tribes, the Aesir and Vanir. Conversion. Through much of the years that the Viking Age occurred in, paganism was the religion of the Scandinavian peoples. Christians referred to the Vikings as pagans and often considered them heathens. Being called a pagan was an insulting term used to describe any groups of people who were not Christian. During the Viking Age, Spain was a predominantly Muslim region. The whole of southern and western Europe was Christian. In the Baltics, there were many different religions, and in Scandinavia, paganism reigned. Christianity spread by missionaries, and the Scandinavians in the south were introduced to the concepts of Christianity in the early years of the Viking Age. Paganism itself was an inclusive religious practice. This area was converted to Christianity somewhat easily. Frisia was converted in the 8th century, the Saxony in the last years of the same century, and from there Francia was integrated. Charlemagne forced a somewhat brutal conversion in Saxony, and the Christian missionaries continued north and east as political conditions in the regions allowed. Denmark was officially indoctrinated in 960 into Christianity, and eventually Sweden followed suit during the 11th century, but at a much slower progression. In 1000, the Viking settlements along the Atlantic accepted Christian conversion. Christian conversion of these regions was used as a tool to strengthen the hold of royal power, and once Scandinavians were thoroughly converted, they spread the newer religion to the Baltic areas, but missionary endeavors were not coordinated or united. During the Viking Age, the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church were rivaling faiths, and while many Vikings were introduced to the Orthodox Church by way of Byzantium, it was the Roman Catholic Church who prevailed in Scandinavia. By the time that Christianity became the official religion in Scandinavia, many Vikings had already been exposed and introduced to the religion. Some Vikings had even already been converted. A large number of Viking explorers and conquerors had been baptized while abroad on expeditions, and baptism was often a stipulation of many treaties and political alliances, and these peace treaties would be followed by a feast and celebration. Some Vikings had even been exposed to Christianity by their families, who had immigrated to England, Normandy, and Ireland, and for many centuries prior to the formal conversion, there were missionaries arriving in Scandinavia, as well as traders and merchants from Christian regions. The first known missionary to try to convert the King of Danes to Christianity was known as Apostle of the Frisians. This missionary preached in 823 in Denmark, and it is said that he baptized many people during his travels in the region. It is thought that this missionary was sent to show political support of Louis the Pious by King Harald Klak, as Harald was the first Viking king to be baptized, which was recorded in 826. A Christian missionary named Ansgar traveled to Denmark from Francia with King Harald and went about the region spreading the ideals of Christianity until Harald was exiled in 827. Ansgar's efforts in Scandinavia was met with pagan backlash at times, and in the mid-9th century, it seems the political environment changed and his conversion efforts weren't accepted or necessarily welcomed by many. Somewhere during the 930s, an Archbishop Uni continued the church's mission work in Scandinavia and traveled to Birka, and it is said that in 934, the Danish king was baptized by force after being defeated by the forces of the German king of the time, Henry the Fowler. Christianity began to spread throughout Scandinavia to the east and northern regions, and more bishops were established as the Vikings began to accept the Christian faith more and more. In Sweden and Norway, conversion was held up for a time by resistance, but eventually conversion succeeded, and conversion to Christianity led to baptism. Christianity was a religion of goodness and victory, and these ideas appealed to the pagan Vikings. During times of war and violence, the Christian missionaries preached peace and then followed their words with actions. refusing to seek revenge when their missions and monasteries were burned. Christians gave alms to the poor and spoke of equality, and the concept of heaven piqued interest as well. To the Vikings, this new religion was interpreted as a way to strengthen power, as the church was central to many regions they were invading. It was wealthy and dependent on the kingdoms where it was practiced. Over time, preachers and missionaries took over the functions of local chieftains, and this made it easier for kings who supported Christianity to introduce and impose new government practices and societal rules. By accepting Christianity, it also negated other regions' reasons for attacking and using the defense of the one true God as an excuse for their actions. Missionaries in Scandinavia familiarized themselves with the customs and practices of the Vikings to aid in the success of conversion, and learn the language of the Vikings to encourage communication and debate. Often missionaries would seek out permission from kings to show respect before preaching in regions, and some brought riches with them to give an offering to those who ruled to gain permissions. This has been Vikings, a concise history of the Vikings, written by Bernard Hayes. Narrated by J. Huff. Copyright 2017 by Bernard Hayes. Production copyright 2017 by Bernard Hayes.